I walked into my own cabin one evening only to find strangers wandering through it with a real Taro without my knowledge or permission. To my disbelief, the HOA president herself was there, strutting around like she had some legal claim, insisting that my home was required for her so-called weekend emergency. My hands were shaking with a mix of anger and fear. This woman was trying to hijack my only home. When I threw them out and told her she had no right, she didn't just back off as she started a full-blown campaign against me that spiraled into a public meltdown. And trust me, the way I turned the tables on her was satisfying. But let me back up and explain, because this whole situation sounds unbelievable. It was a Tuesday night, around 9:30. I was in my grandfather's old cabin, just like I am most nights, trying to repair whatever was falling apart this time. That evening it was the handmade fireplace, something my grandfather built piece by piece back in the 1970s. This place isn't a luxury getaway, it's literally all I have left of my family. My name's Peter Collins. I'm 42, a former lawyer who walked away from the profession after it chewed me up and spat me out. When I inherited this cabin, I poured my entire $30,000 in savings into restoring it. That's everything I had. I barely scraped by as it is, and if I ever lost this place, I'd have nowhere to go. This cabin is my whole world, my grandfather's legacy, and the only place that feels like home. So there I was, covered in soot from working on the fireplace, when a loud, insistent knock rattled the door. Not the polite kind of knock, this one practically shouted, "I'm in charge. Open up." I peeked out the window and spotted a middle-aged woman in a sharp business suit clutching an oversized binder. She was pacing, checking her watch, radiating impatience. My husky, Reeksa, my loyal companion and better judge of character than most people, started growling low. He knew she was trouble. Honestly, I should have trusted his instincts and ignored the door, but out of habit and politeness, I opened it. Biggest mistake I could have made. "Are you Peter Collins?" She barked before I could even say hello. Then she introduced herself as Christina Walsh, president of the Sunset Valley HOA. She claimed she was there about some weekend emergency protocol. Her voice was sharp, like every word was in bold capital letters. She shoved the binder in my face and began flipping through it frantically, declaring, "This cabin is required for her weekend emergency protocol activation." I stood there in dirty work clothes, completely baffled. "Ma'am, what exactly is this weekend emergency you're talking about?" I asked. A big mistake. Her eyes lit up, and she launched into this bizarre tirade where nearly every sentence included the words "her weekend." It was like she couldn't form a thought without them. At first I wondered if she was having some sort of medical episode. I tried to explain calmly, "Look, I don't know what this is about, but this is private property. You don't have any authority here." Her expression hardened. She held out her hand like a queen demanding tribute. "Give me your keys immediately for her weekend emergency access," she ordered. That's when something inside me snapped. These weren't just keys. My grandfather had carved the wooden handles himself and handed them to me before he passed, telling me to protect this place. "No," I said firmly, "this is my home, my grandfather's legacy. You need to leave." The shock on her face was almost comical, like no one had ever told her no before. Then she shrieked, "Your refusal violates our weekend protocol." "Refusal is not accepted." I stood my ground. "I don't care about your so-called weekend. You have no authority here." That's when she really lost it. She ranted about consequences and enforcement, waving her binder around like it was some sacred law book. But when I managed to snatch it for a closer look, my stomach dropped. Every page was blank, just the words "and her weekend" scribbled over and over in different colors, like some deranged diary. At that moment, my neighbor Thomas, a retired teacher who lived nearby, appeared after hearing the commotion. He took one glance and said calmly, "Christina, that's just a binder full of nonsense." She clutched it to her chest like he'd tried to steal her baby, hissing, "Fine, her weekend has other methods. Her weekend never gives up." Her words tumbled out faster and faster, like a broken record. As she stormed away, some papers slipped from the binder. When I picked them up, my blood ran cold. One was an invoice from someone named Brandon Walsh for her weekend property preparation and takeover totaling $500. This wasn't just some unstable woman making things up on the spot. This was a plan, organized, funded, thought out. If someone was being paid to prepare my property for a so-called takeover, then this had been in motion long before she came knocking. Rex pressed close to me, his protective stance confirming what I already felt. Something dangerous was happening. Thomas's worried look said the same thing. "Peter," he warned, "I think refusing her just started something you're not ready for." And he was right. That simple word in HOA had triggered an operation that had been brewing for months. Christina wasn't just a random HOA busybody. She had paperwork, she had money behind her, and she had this bizarre cult-like obsession with her weekend that she clearly believed gave her real power. The realization made my skin crawl. How many others had fallen victim to this madness? How many homes had already been seized under this delusion? That night, I stayed up combing through every scrap of paper I had picked up, slowly piecing together just how deep this insanity went. What I pieced together from those papers was beyond disturbing. There were bogus notes about compliance violations, fabricated emergency shelter rules, and even community safety protocols. All of it sounded official enough that someone unfamiliar with the law might actually believe it. But to me, it was clear nonsense. Worse yet, I found rough sketches of my cabin with notes on entry points and what looked like a step-by-step timeline for her so-called weekend takeover. She had been surveying my property, planning out every move as if it were a military operation, all with the intent of ripping away the home my grandfather had poured his life into. The level of premeditation was chilling. And then it hit me. My refusal earlier had intended things that had triggered them. Christina had shown up expecting resistance and already had contingencies prepared. The invoice I found from Brandon Walsh wasn't just about prep work, it was payment for the next phase of her scheme. This wasn't a random power play, it was a full-on campaign. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Saying no to Christina Walsh was not the end. It was the opening shot. She had allies, resources, and a fanatical obsession with this imaginary weekend that wouldn't be stopped by facts or the law. But what rattled me most was the $500 invoice itself. If this was just an unstable HOA president with a wild imagination, why was money changing hands? And who exactly was Brandon Walsh? Was this all pre-planned? Had she already tried it with other people? That thought kept me awake all night. I paced my cabin until sunrise, fueled by adrenaline and paranoia. Digging into property law online, I scoured legal databases, HOA bylaws, and state emergency codes. Absolutely now eerie was there any mention of a weekend protocol. By the time the sun rose, I was certain Christina had no legal standing whatsoever. Unfortunately, that knowledge didn't help me feel any safer. Desperation makes people dangerous, and this woman's fixation had crossed into something personal. By morning, I called Thomas just to reassure myself I wasn't losing my grip. "Thomas," I asked, "in all your years here, have you ever heard of these weekend emergency protocols?" His answer sank like a stone in my stomach. "Peter, there's no such thing. She's either completely unhinged or running one of the most elaborate property scams I've ever seen." Great. So either I was dealing with mental instability or outright fraud. And honestly, I wasn't sure which was worse. Right at 8 a.m. sharp, like she'd been sitting in her car, waiting for the clock to strike, Christina marched back up to my porch, this time carrying an even thicker binder. Scrawled across the front in red marker were the words, "Her weekend legal documentation, enforcement authority." It looked more like something from a child's meltdown than an actual legal record. She started rattling off a string of nonsense. Municipal Her Weekend Code 15B requires immediate compliance for community emergencies. Every sentence was a mouthful of gibberish, dressed up in pseudo-legal jargon. When I pressed her to show me the actual statute, she got defensive, claiming her weekend law supersedes standard municipal regulations, which doesn't even make sense. And then Brandon showed up. Suddenly, everything clicked in the worst possible way. He had the same family resemblance, a stubborn jawline, uneasy eyes, and carried a toolbox like he'd been drafted into the madness. "And Christina said you needed structural compliance work," he mumbled, clearly confused about what he was even supposed to be doing. When I asked him to explain, He fumbled some nonsense about making the property compliant for safety protocols. It was obvious he had no idea what any of it meant. Christina, however, immediately started coaching him like a deranged coach on the sidelines. Document the violations. List the safety concerns. She barked, waving her fake paperwork. Brandon looked like he wanted to disappear, but he stayed up probably because he needed the money. Later, I learned he was drowning in over $80,000 of student debt, and Christina had promised him steady construction work if he went along with her so-called projects. She was preying on his desperation to fuel her scam, and then came the moment that still spikes my blood pressure. While I was distracted arguing with Christina, Brandon slipped into my basement. Moments later, I heard rushing water. When I ran downstairs, I caught him using bolt cutters on my pipes. I shouted, but I could hear him on the phone with Christina. And Christina, this feels really wrong. A broken bar. Her voice came through loud and clear. Her weekend requires safe properties. Her weekend protocols demand immediate improvements. By the time I got him out of there, I was already staring at nearly $3,000 worth of water damage. My insurance refused to cover it, claiming the cuts looked like neglect instead of vandalism. Neglect. The cuts were straight and clean, obviously deliberate, but that was just the beginning. That very afternoon, Christina launched a community-wide smear campaign. She called every neighbor within half a mile, telling them I was blocking her weekend emergency shelter plan and putting everyone at risk. Even Mrs. Henderson, a kind older woman down the road, phoned me sounding worried. Peter, dear, a broken bar. Christina says you're preventing some kind of community shelter project, and people could get hurt. Is that true? I explained the entire thing was a fabrication. She paused, then dropped a chilling detail. You know, Christina called me 3 weeks ago about using my property for emergency purposes. I thought it sounded odd, but I brushed it off. That was the moment it hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't a spontaneous power grab. Christina had been working this angle for weeks and maybe even months. She wasn't just harassing me, she was targeting multiple properties, spinning her fake weekend authority as a way to seize homes. This wasn't delusion alone. It was a calculated campaign. The thought that other families might have already fallen victim to Christina's madness made me sick. How many people had been too intimidated or too confused to question her phony authority? All week, the harassment escalated. Each morning, Christina showed up with new legal documents as supposed injunctions, emergency powers, and court orders. In reality, they were nothing more than office supply templates with nonsense typed in, or completely blank pages with her weekend scribbled across them. Thomas Smith, who actually works in local government, finally confronted her. He flipped through one of her legal packets and said exactly what everyone else was thinking. Christina, these are blank forms from Staples with her weekend written in crayon. You can't just invent laws and expect people to buy it. But Christina had a comeback for everything. She claimed her documents were confidential and that we simply couldn't understand the higher complexities of her weekend municipal emergency protocols. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop watching Brandon's downward spiral. Ever since he damaged my pipes, you could see the guilt written all over him. He started dragging his feet on assignments, making excuses, clearly desperate to avoid more sabotage. One night, I overheard him on the phone with his girlfriend. She keeps going on about her weekend like it's some official government program, he muttered. But when I ask her what it actually means, she just repeats the same words over and over. I think she's losing her mind. His girlfriend's reply was blunt. Brandon, weekends aren't emergencies. Normal people don't build fake laws around Saturday and Sunday. You need to get away from her before she drags you down with her. She was right. Of course but Brandon was stuck. Student debt hanging over his head, family pressure, and the lure of steady work kept him tethered to Christina's delusion. That's how manipulators operate. Find someone vulnerable, exploit their weakness, and pull them deeper into the scheme until they're trapped. Watching this kid being used by his own aunt was almost as infuriating as her attempts to steal my home. By the end of the week, it was clear Christina wasn't going to suddenly snap back to reality. Her obsession was intensifying, and she genuinely believed she held real authority. That was the scariest part. When someone is that detached from reality, What happens when the fake paperwork and vandalism don't work anymore? I was about to find out. The following Tuesday, Christina escalated again. She sent out a mass email with the subject line, "Community Safety Crisis." I actually counted 14 exclamation marks. 14, as if that made it more official. The email called for an emergency home meeting, even though my cabin wasn't even within HOA boundaries. In it, she demanded attendance from every resident to address the so-called threat I posed by refusing her protocols. The meeting was held at the Sunset Valley Community Center, a dull little hall usually reserved for bingo nights and birthday parties, but Christina turned it into her stage. About 30 neighbors showed up, which is a huge turnout for our quiet community, and Christina had gone all in. She had a PowerPoint presentation complete with charts and graphs, stacks of official-looking binders, and even brought in Marcus Thompson, a local contractor who clearly owed her money, to serve as her expert witness on the alleged dangers my cabin posed. Her strategy was obvious: overwhelm people with visuals and jargon to make herself look credible, while painting me as some selfish recluse endangering everyone else. The split in the room happened almost immediately. On Christina's side, Mrs. Walker, who was terrified of her property value tanking if there really was a safety crisis, and Dave Wilson, who owed Christina a favor for fast-tracking his permit the year before. On my side, Thomas, of course, Bob Rodriguez from the hardware store, who dealt with Christina's antics before, and the Johnsons, a family with teens who clearly saw through the nonsense. But the majority of people, they were just confused, caught between Christina's official presentations and my insistence that it was all a lie. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. Can anyone here show me the written policy for her weekend emergency protocols? Who exactly is her? Which municipal authority approved these rules? Basic, reasonable questions, the kind anyone would ask before surrendering their property. Christina's response, completely unhinged. She shouted, "It's emergency protocol. Her weekend doesn't need written policy because her weekend is the emergency response." The more I pressed, the more frantic she became. People were beginning to notice she literally could not explain what her weekend meant without spiraling. Christina's response devolved into pure chaos. Instead of answering questions, she just started repeating the phrase "her weekend" over and over again, faster, louder, until it sounded like some broken machine stuck on repeat. She hurled papers into the air as she chanted, and when people picked them up, they discovered most were completely blank, except for the words "her weekend" documentation scrawled across the top in red marker. The room went completely silent. Dozens of neighbors stood frozen, staring at a grown woman having what was clearly a very public mental collapse over imaginary emergency weekend protocols. Even Mrs. Walker, one of her staunchest supporters up until that very moment, leaned toward her husband and whispered aloud enough for half the room to hear Harold, "I think this woman is unstable." Brandon, who had been sitting as far back as possible, looked like he wanted to melt into his chair. But when his aunt began her meltdown, he finally stood and tried to step in. "Aunt Christina, a broken bar, maybe we should pause for a bit, just take a moment to calm down." That single suggestion sent her spiraling further. Christina shrieked, "Calm down? Her weekend never calms down. Her weekend is eternal. Her weekend cannot be stopped." Marcus Thompson, the unlucky contractor she dragged along, clearly saw disaster unfolding. He quietly gathered his papers and slipped out the door. Brandon's girlfriend, who had come just to witness the circus, tugged his arm and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Brandon, your aunt is literally having a breakdown over weekends. This isn't normal. Weekends aren't emergencies." The heartbreak on Brandon's face was obvious. He was finally realizing he'd been manipulated into enabling someone deeply unwell. From there, the meeting collapsed into pandemonium. People shuffled out while Christina ranted to a half-empty room about protocols no one else could comprehend. But then Thomas Smith, who had been quietly digging into HOA records, delivered a revelation that shifted the whole conversation. He explained that Christina's election to the HOA board had happened during a special vote with only about 12% of residents participating, meaning most neighbors had no idea what they were voting for. More importantly, the bylaws clearly stated that any emergency protocols required 2/3 approval. something Christina had never even come close to getting. That announcement hit the remaining audience like a thunderclap. People who'd been wavering suddenly realized they'd been duped by someone with no legitimate power at all. As folks filed into the parking lot, I overheard whispers that gave me the first bit of relief I'd felt in weeks. "Did you count how many times she said her weekend?" I stopped at 47 in 10 minutes. My kids think weekends are for video games and sleeping in, not declaring emergencies. In 25 years of marriage, I've never seen anyone break down about Saturday and Sunday. The consensus was clear. Christina had lost all credibility. Several neighbors even pulled me aside to apologize for doubting me. "Peter, we're sorry, that woman is clearly unwell, but I knew better than to think it was over." Christina's obsession with my property felt too personal, too targeted, for this to simply be about rules or power. The way she glared at my cabin wasn't the look of someone enforcing protocols, it was vengeance. Driving home that night, I noticed her car trailing mine halfway before she finally turned back toward her neighborhood. My gut told me this wasn't the end. Her meltdown wasn't a final, it was just act 2 of something far worse. That suspicion was confirmed when, the very next morning, a county inspector named Lopez arrived in an official truck, clipboard in hand, with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor of a man who had seen every type of property squabble imaginable. For a moment, I felt relief. A real authority figure. Surely, he'd see through Christina's nonsense in minutes. What I hadn't counted on was that Christina had apparently stayed up the entire night building a massive presentation designed to look professional and damning. She had forged structural reports, fabricated community safety documents, and bundled enough fake paperwork to overwhelm anyone who didn't have the time or patience to fact-check every page. The second Lopez parked, Christina rushed him like a prosecutor in court, binder in hand, rattling off jargon so quickly I thought she'd pass out. "Inspector Lopez, thank goodness you're here. This property has multiple serious weekend violations that endanger community safety." She practically dragged him around my cabin, pointing at random pipes, boards, and windows while cross-referencing her fraudulent binder like a deranged tour guide. From my porch, it felt surreal. Luckily, I had started live-streaming the whole encounter partly as evidence, partly because Thomas had suggested it could be crucial if this escalated legally. To my shock, over 5,000 people were already watching live, flooding the chat with questions like, "The broken bar, what is her weekend? Is this even real law?" When Lopez finally walked over to me, he wore an expression that gave me a flicker of hope. Confusion. "Sir, can you help me understand this weekend emergency protocol that Miss Walsh keeps referencing? I've been inspecting properties for 15 years, and I've never come across anything like it." I gave him the unvarnished truth. "Inspector, that's because it doesn't exist. Nobody knows what her weekend means, and not even her. She's been harassing me for weeks over an imaginary set of rules she can't explain to anyone, including herself." Lopez turned back to Christina with the weary patience of a man who'd seen plenty of bureaucratic nonsense. "Ma'am, let me clarify, who exactly is her in her weekend, and what municipal authority officially created these emergency protocols?" Christina's face twisted through a carousel of emotion to confusion, anger, panic all in rapid succession. Christina's face twisted through confusion, panic, anger, and then back to blank bewilderment, like her brain was short-circuiting in real time. Then, right on cue, she launched into her usual deranged chant, but this time it was louder, sharper, and far more frantic. "Her weekend requires this property for community. Her weekend's safety. Her weekend is an emergency." She was practically shrieking. Lopez just stared at her as though she were speaking some forgotten language, and honestly, ancient Greek would have made more sense than the nonsense spilling from her mouth. Meanwhile, the livestream was exploding. Thousands of viewers were dissecting every detail, some even pausing frames of the damaged pipes. One person, going by Builder Bob, laid out a technical breakdown explaining that the cuts were far too clean to be natural. Within minutes, multiple contractors in the chat confirmed it had to be power tool work. Then the hashtags started popping up in real time. #weekend scam, #cabingate, #Christina exposed. What had started as me just trying to cover my back was snowballing into a full-blown crowd investigation, with thousands of strangers pooling knowledge, pointing out inconsistencies, and even offering legal strategy. Lopez, unfazed, took his time combing over my place, carefully checking each of Christina's claims against actual county code. She wouldn't stop interrupting, rambling about ordinances that didn't exist, waving binders full of fake paperwork, and invoking emergency rules she couldn't back up with a single shred of real documentation. When Lopez finally pressed her for the actual municipal code number, Christina doubled down, blurting out, "Her weekend ordinance 47 establishes her weekend community shelter requirements." Lopez raised an eyebrow and asked to see a copy. Of course, she had nothing. Ordinance 47X was pure fiction. That's when Lopez laid it down. "Ma'am, unless you can show me real documentation, I'll have to treat this as a case of false reporting and harassment." Brandon, who'd been lingering awkwardly nearby, looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Lopez turned to him directly. "Son, did you deliberately damage this property?" The kid grumbled immediately. "Yes, sir, a broken bar, but it was for her weekend emergency prep, and Christina told me the place needed to be in violation so it would qualify for shelter status." The silence that followed was brutal. Then Lopez asked the obvious, "And what exactly is her weekend?" Brandon's answer blew the whole thing wide open. "Yeah, broken bar, honestly don't know, sir. Every time I asked, she just repeated the words over and over. She paid me $500 to create problems so she could fix them for her weekend." And just like that, Christina's scam unraveled on camera in front of over 15,000 people. The chat went wild. "She's lost it. A broken bar, her weekend is a cult. A broken bar, Brandon just confessed to everything." Lopez immediately called for backup, citing deliberate property damage and potential fraud. Christina's reaction was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd just watched her delusion get obliterated in real time. "Brandon is a traitor to her weekend. He doesn't understand her weekend protocols," she screeched. By then, nobody was buying it, not the inspector, not the community, not even Brandon himself. And when she turned to him for support, all he did was shake his head and say softly, "And Christina, a broken bar, maybe her weekend isn't real, maybe you need help." Her response? To scream at him, calling him a traitor to her weekend. It was over. Christina had publicly demolished whatever credibility she still had. The live stream viewership skyrocketed as people watched her hurl binders at Lopez's truck, babbling like a fanatic. By the time Lopez wrapped up his report, hashtags were trending worldwide and news outlets were starting to sniff around the story. But instead of feeling relief, I felt a knot in my stomach. People that deepen their own delusions don't stop because someone proves them wrong. If anything, exposure only makes them more dangerous. Sure enough, within days it escalated. Brandon, shaken by everything, decided to cooperate with the authorities. He turned over texts, payment records, and evidence showing Christina had orchestrated the entire scheme. The state housing unit opened a full-blown investigation, serious enough that words like fraud and even RICO started coming up if more victims came forward. By Monday morning, Christina's so-called authority was legally frozen. She was banned from contacting me or touching anything to do with my property under threat of arrest. It should have been the end. But I knew better. Christina's face twisted with pure confusion, like her brain had just short-circuited. Then, right on cue, she launched into her trademark broken record speech, only this time louder and more desperate than I'd ever heard. Her weekend needs this property for community. Her weekend is safety. This community is her weekend. It's an emergency. Lopez just stood there, staring at her like she was reciting some ancient script no one had translated in centuries. Honestly, ancient Greek probably would have made more sense than the nonsense she was spewing. Meanwhile, the live stream chat had completely erupted. People were analyzing the pipe damage in real time, pointing out how the cuts were way too sharp and uniform to be normal wear. A user called Builder Bob posted a full breakdown proving the damage had been made with power tools, and within minutes other contractors jumped in to confirm it. Hashtags were suddenly trending. #HerWeekendScam, #CabinGate, #Christina Exposed. What had started as me simply recording my lunatic neighbor harassing me had snowballed into a full-blown internet investigation, with thousands of strangers offering expert insight, technical analysis, and even legal advice for free. Lopez spent nearly an hour combing over every inch of my property, carefully comparing Christina's claims to actual building codes and safety regulations. The whole time, she kept butting in, rattling off imaginary ordinances and fake emergency procedures she could never actually prove. When Lopez finally pressed her for the specific laws she kept referencing, she made her biggest mistake yet to trying to bluff a professional who actually knew municipal law. Her weekend ordinance 47X requires shelter compliance during emergencies, she declared confidently. Lopez raised an eyebrow and asked her to produce it. Of course, she couldn't because it didn't exist. That's when Lopez dropped the hammer. "Ma'am, unless you can provide real documentation, I'll have to conclude these are fabricated claims meant to harass this property owner." Brandon, who had been hovering nervously nearby the whole time, looked like he wanted to disappear. His aunt's fantasy world was crashing into cold, hard reality. Finally, Lopez turned to him directly. "Son, did you intentionally damage this property?" Brandon froze, then crumbled under the pressure. "Yes, sir, a broken bar, but it was for her weekend emergency prep. Aunt Christina told me the place needed violations so it could qualify for her weekend shelter status." Lopez stared at him for a long, heavy moment before asking the obvious. "What exactly is her weekend?" And that's when the truth came out. Brandon admitted, "I don't actually know, sir. Every time I asked, she'd just repeat it over and over. She gave me $500 to create problems so she could affix them for her weekend." The chat exploded as thousands of viewers watched live as Christina's elaborate scam unraveled in real time. Comments flew, "She's delusional. She's running a cult. Brandon's confessing everything." Lopez immediately radioed for backup, saying he had clear evidence of intentional property damage and possible fraud. Christina, instead of backing down, doubled down. "Brandon is a traitor to her weekend. He doesn't understand the protocols," she shrieked. But when she realized the inspector, her own nephew, the community, and 15,000 online viewers had dismissed her fantasy as nonsense, she snapped. She hurled binders at Lopez's truck, screaming, "You don't understand. Her weekend is emergency. Her weekend is community. Her weekend is everything." The meltdown was broadcast live to thousands. People watched as a grown woman completely unraveled over rules that existed only in her imagination. Brandon looked devastated, shaking his head in shame. Finally, he told her, "Aunt Christina, maybe her weekend isn't real. Maybe you need help." Her only response was to scream, "Traitor to her weekend," sealing the deal that she was completely disconnected from reality. By the time Lopez finished his report, the entire mess had gone viral. Hashtags were trending, news outlets were picking up the story, and Christina was being escorted away, still mumbling about her imaginary ordinances. But as I watched, I realized something chilling. This wasn't over. People like her don't just stop because they're proven wrong. If anything, the public humiliation might push her to do something even more reckless. The chat celebrated while Brandon apologized for his part in the scheme, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Lopez filed his report with the state housing authority that very same day, and by Friday morning, I got a call that changed everything. "Mr. Collins, this is Grace Morgan with the State Housing Investigation Unit. We're launching a formal investigation into HOA abuse and property fraud in your area, based on Inspector Lopez's report and the evidence provided by Brandon Walsh." Brandon was working with the state. Turns out, after witnessing his aunt's public breakdown, he decided to spill everything. He handed over text messages, payment records, and full documentation of her scam. The state considered it serious enough to look at possible organized property fraud charges, maybe even RICO, if other victims stepped forward. By Monday morning, an emergency order dropped like a hammer. Christina's so-called HOA powers were suspended, her harassment had to stop immediately, and she was banned from contacting me or my property under threat of arrest. Christina showed up to court clutching a binder labeled "Her Weekend Constitutional Rights" scribbled in purple crayon, which really should have been the first clue she hadn't accepted reality. When Judge Smith asked her to explain her actions and show any sign of remorse, she launched into the longest, most unhinged "Her Weekend" tirade the world had ever heard. "Your Honor, I demand her weekend justice. This entire trial violates her weekend constitutional protections and her weekend emergency community rights," she shouted. Judge Smith, a man with 3 decades on the bench who thought he had seen it all, looked genuinely baffled. He interrupted her. "Miss Walsh, I need you to clearly explain what her weekend actually is, because I've never encountered it in any legal framework in my 30 years of practice." Her response was the start of the most spectacular public unraveling I'd ever seen. "Your Honor doesn't understand her weekend? How is that possible? Her weekend is the foundation of law. Her weekend is safety. Her weekend is justice," she wailed. No matter how many times the judge pressed her for an explanation, she just repeated the phrase like a broken record, incapable of stringing together anything resembling logic. The live stream chat was going absolutely wild. The 100,000 people were watching this disaster unfold in real time. Christina started screaming her weekend, while flinging her papers across the courtroom like confetti. And when people actually picked them up, the pages were blank except for her weekend documentation scrawled in different colored crayons, like something out of kindergarten art class. When a bailiff tried to calm her down, Christina lashed out, shrieking, "You're violating her weekend protocols. I spent 15 years preparing for this, and you're destroying it all." Then came the line that instantly turned into an internet meme, "Give me her weekend, or give me death." Security had to drag her out of the courtroom while she continued screaming about her weekend, her voice echoing through the halls. This was supposed to be her weekend. Her weekend belongs to me. Her weekend is my whole life. Viewers clipped every second. Hashtags explode at a her weekend meltdown. Give me her weekend or death. Christina unhinged. Later, Judge Smith told reporters that in 30 years, he had never witnessed someone suffer such a complete mental collapse over imaginary emergency protocols that literally no one else understood. Outside the courthouse, I ended up speaking directly to the 100,000 livestream viewers. It felt surreal. To everyone who has been following Thesa today, we saw undeniable proof that her weekend was nothing but a delusion. It never existed. It never made sense to anyone except Christina, I said. The community that had backed me throughout this nightmare cheered, though the moment felt more sad than victorious. Brandon awkwardly waved at the camera and admitted, "Sorry I helped with the faker weekend thing. Everyone, I definitely learned my lesson about helping relatives with imaginary emergencies." The sentencing that followed was surprisingly balanced, a justice mixed with mercy. Christina got 3 years probation, $10,000 restitution to victims, 500 hours of community service, and mandatory mental health treatment. The kicker, she was legally barred from mentioning her weekend in public. If she did, jail time would be immediate. Judge Smith noted that her breakdown clearly showed serious psychological issues that needed treatment, not just punishment. Brandon was spared jail in exchange for his cooperation. He got probation, community service, and was required to repair all the property damage free of charge. The HOA itself went through major reforms, turning into a model for other communities. New rules required that any emergency declarations be verified by county officials and approved by at least 2/3 of residents. 6 months later, the turnaround was incredible. Christina was living in another town, receiving treatment, and working quietly at a hardware store, strictly forbidden from mentioning her obsession. Brandon had started a legitimate construction business, with the slogan "No Scam Construction," and he'd just gotten engaged. As for me, my YouTube channel about property rights hit 100,000 subscribers, helping other people spot scams like the one Christina tried to pull. Our community even implemented what we jokingly called Christina-proof protocols to prevent another HOA abuse case. Not a single fake emergency or bogus regulation popped up since. The best part wasn't Christina's punishment, it was the healing. People finally felt safe in their own homes again, knowing no one could wave fake papers and threaten their property with nonsense rules. The Sunset Valley HOA became known for transparency and accountability, with every policy documented and all emergency powers tightly regulated by outside oversight. Some evenings, I'd sit on my porch with Rex, watching the sun dip through the same pine trees my grandfather planted, thinking about how sometimes the people who seem to hold power actually have none at all. Her weekend was finally over, and our community could go back to enjoying ordinary, peaceful weekends like normal people. The recovery came easier than expected. Once the state wrapped up its investigation and stripped Christina of her so-called authority, everything settled quickly. My finances were restored through insurance, and the community even held a fundraiser to cover my legal costs and lost time. Neighbors I barely knew dropped off casseroles and offered to help with repairs, apologizing for not believing me sooner. Brandon kept his word too. For 2 straight months, he showed up every evening and weekend, fixing everything he'd damaged without taking a single cent. He constantly told people, "I'm repairing what I broke here and learning real construction ethics while I do it." His girlfriend stood proudly by him, telling others that his choice to admit the truth and reject family manipulation only made her respect him more. "It takes courage to admit you were wrong and make it right," she said. "That's the kind of man I want to build a life with." 6 months later, they were engaged. As for Christina, she stayed far away from our community, reportedly making progress with her mental health treatment. Rumors floated back that she was finally getting real help for the trauma and obsessive need for control that fueled her spiral. The important part? She was gone, and the community she tried to break was thriving. As part of her probation, Christina was strictly barred from mentioning anything related to weekends, since even the word itself could trigger her delusions. Once removed from the environment where her fantasies had thrived, therapy actually began to help her. Within 2 months, sweeping HOA reforms were rolled out, changes that quickly became a model for other neighborhoods across the state. The centerpiece was what everyone jokingly nicknamed the Christina Clause. No emergency powers could be activated unless fully documented, approved by at least 2/3 of homeowners, and verified by county authorities. From then on, verbal claims, imaginary policies, or self-declared emergencies had zero standing. Any HOA officer who cited non-existent rules would be suspended immediately and sent for a mental health review. And perhaps the most important piece: no HOA could ever impose authority on properties outside its borders, no matter the excuse. Surprisingly, the community healed faster than I expected. Once everyone realized Christina had been preying on their legitimate fears about safety and home values, people turned those same concerns into advocacy for fairness and transparency. Mrs. Walker, once one of Christina's loudest allies, became a leading voice for accountability. "We thought we were protecting our homes," she admitted, "but we were actually helping someone exploit our neighbors." Even Dave Wilson, who had once supported her phony claims, apologized publicly and joined Thomas Smith to design permanent oversight procedures. The relief was almost universal. Residents who had backed Christina at first seemed grateful to discover there was no actual threat, just one woman's elaborate revenge fantasy. And thanks to the viral storm online, our neighborhood wasn't remembered as the place with the home meltdown, but instead as an example of how communities could unite to shut down fraud. The meltdown videos racked up over 10 million views, and soon enough, legal scholars were citing our case as proof that social media could shield property owners from harassment. Several states even passed laws limiting HOA emergency powers, inspired partly by our ordeal. On a personal level, life finally settled into peace. I rebuilt my freelance law practice and turned my channel, originally just a way to document Christina's antics, into a hub for property rights advocacy. Messages poured in from across the country from people asking how to stand up to abusive HOAs. Rex, no longer pacing at the door or growling at Christina's car, seemed like a different dog altogether, calm, happy, finally enjoying the quiet cabin life my grandfather had dreamed of when he built this home. Evenings by the stone fireplace felt sacred again, without the shadow of fake emergencies hanging over us. The biggest lesson was simple: protecting what matters sometimes means standing up to people who look powerful but have no real authority. Christina's entire scam had depended on neighbors being too polite, too unsure, or too intimidated to ask basic questions like "show me the rule" or "where's the written policy?" Once those questions were asked publicly, her whole scheme collapsed. The truth was clear: there was nothing behind her threats except people's willingness to be bullied. And it struck me, the very moment I refused to hand over my keys, her entire plan began to unravel. That small act of resistance forced her fantasy to collide with reality, and in the end, That collision didn't just save my property, it probably spared other families from falling victim to her schemes. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is say no and stand by it with evidence, community support, and common sense. Because weekends aren't emergencies, and imaginary policies aren't laws. But the story didn't end there. 3 years after Christina's sentencing, something completely unexpected happened. The FBI, through her probation officer, reached out with an offer: testify against a multi-state property fraud ring operating across 8 states. It would be dangerous, national exposure, possible retaliation, even the need for relocation, but her cooperation could help take down over 20 career scammers. And in a move that shocked everyone, including herself, Christina agreed. "I caused pain to innocent families," she said. "If I can endure a little more to stop others from doing the same, then I owe it to them." Her testimony and undercover assistance sparked the largest property fraud bust in regional history. 23 arrests, $47 million recovered, and over 150 families getting their homes back. Media headlines flipped the script, calling her from predator to protector and the redemption of Christina Walsh. Even some of the families she'd once targeted publicly acknowledged her transformation. The ripple effects were enormous. Our HOA reform model was adopted by more than 150 communities nationwide. Thomas Smith became a traveling consultant for neighborhoods determined to root out abuse. Marcus Thompson expanded his construction company into a national franchise called Redemption Construction, hiring people with rough pasts but a commitment to honest work. Even Rex played a role. Leah, his instincts had been so sharp that he became the inspiration for a property guardian dog training program, teaching other dogs to detect hidden damage during inspections. As for Christina, her obsession with Weekend turned into a mission of service. She became a trauma counselor for victims of property fraud. "My Weekend is helping others protect theirs," she declared at a national property rights conference. Brandon, once her pawn, built a thriving business around the motto "honest work builds trust," employing ex-addicts and former offenders determined to make a positive change. Our community even started hosting an annual property rights weekend, at this time a real, legitimate event. Christina spoke as a keynote guest, controversial at first, but her words resonated. "I know predators because I was one. I know the tricks because I used them. And I know the warning signs because I created them. That's why I can help protect families now." Years later, I sat on my porch at sunset with Rex at my feet and my young grandson, Tommy, on my lap. My daughter had named him after Thomas Smith, a tribute that always brought me to tears. Teaching him about his great-grandfather's craftsmanship and the cabin's legacy carried new meaning. It wasn't just about our family, but about protecting the dreams of others too. Christina still called occasionally to check in, now sounding genuinely calm, even asking if there had been any suspicious HOA activity nearby. Brandon, with his fiancée copyright kids, was teaching the next generation how to build things that helped people instead of hurting them. Looking around at the children playing in yards their families truly owned, I realized the true victory wasn't just keeping my cabin safe. It was transforming an enemy into an ally, and turning one community's nightmare into a nationwide shield against fraud. For 5 years straight, Pine Ridge saw 0 property scams. Survivors of Christina's schemes became teachers and advocates across the country. My own advocacy work helped prevent millions in annual scam losses. And Rex, he'd trained nearly 50 dogs across the nation to sniff out hidden property damage. In the end, the greatest win wasn't destroying Christina. It was helping her stand alongside us in the fight for justice. Her so-called weekend was finally gone, but what rose in its place was something real. A future built on transparency, trust, and the simple truth that every family deserves a safe home.